Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We are all close to 150 alumni registered from MBA EDP cohorts worldwide. So thank you for joining. Appreciate that. We've invited our speaker, Sam Curry. He's the CSO, the Chief Security Officer of Cybereason. So you will have read about his bio. He's got a very illustrious bio in public companies and private companies, and companies that you probably know of: McAfee, CA, MicroStrategy, and now at Cybereason. And Sam has a huge appetite for learning. He has 25 patents to his name. He is completing a master's in counterterrorism. He's starting a PhD in cyber law, if I'm not mistaken.
Cyber
policy, right? And that aspect of Sam we can all relate to. So without further ado, we're going to listen and learn, and please ask all the questions that you want to. Sam had a ringside, just one thing I wanted to say before we start off. Sam had a ringside seat at a company called RSA. You probably remember RSA from the fobs that you carried that generated one-time passwords for us to log in, and probably some of us still carry those fobs. And I think that they were breached at some point of time, and the confidentiality agreement, if I remember correctly, has expired. So Sam should be able to share some very interesting thoughts on that as well. Sam, welcome to INSEAD-TMT. We are really happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vikas. Thank you for the kind introduction and the welcome. And thank you to everyone for having me here with you. I'm just going to share the presentation that I have. And I saw there were some questions ahead of time. I'll try to answer some of them, but feel free to ask questions in the Q&A in the chat. I probably can't read them as I'm presenting, but we will save some time at the end for Q&A. I also thoroughly encourage connecting with me on LinkedIn and ask me anything. Vikas, 100% right. We had our horrendous breach at RSA. I was first the head of product for 3 years and then CTO for 4 years for RSA. That's the ringside. And that breach was a life-changing thing to be at the center of. So the 10-year NDA expired in March, and there's actually a Wired article on it that me and some colleagues who went through it, we were interviewed for. But feel free to ask anything. And I know this is being recorded. I don't mind. Nothing I'm saying here is confidential, but it may involve a lot of my personal perspective. So I look forward to dialogue. So let's dive in. By the way, this is trends, predictions. I have explicitly got some trends spread out, and at the end, I've reserved some space for predictions. So I thought, let's talk about recent news and events to begin with. Cyber's in the press all the time, without a doubt. And some of you may have seen ransomware. In 2019, by the way, ransomware, we already used the term epidemic pre-COVID. We used it to refer to what was happening to municipalities and to healthcare. And then in 2020, of course, we had COVID. We saw attacks that mimicked things like World Health Organization applications, sign-up sheets to get COVID information, and appealing to the urge either to be in the know or to try and do something good. We saw attacks and phishing attacks targeting that. And then we saw exponential growth in ransomware. And on the right here, there's two images. These are from a group called DarkSide. And DarkSide is a ransomware, I'll call it a cartel. I don't particularly like the name ransomware gang. And they had a fake Robin Hood type of appeal. But to put it in perspective, these are the ones that got colonial gas in the United States and affected 45% of the East Coast's oil supply in America, which is over 100 million people. They didn't realize what they had done, but they actually claim to have made donations as if they're robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, even though it's usually about 1% to 2% that they make donations for. And these organizations can't accept this type of donation. They don't want to be tarnished by it, nor should they. So this is all largely, if you'll forgive me, BS. We've seen deaths due to ransomware reported. I'm saying it's debatable. There have been some cases of where people in hospitals, one in Washington State and one in Germany, in Dusseldorf, where there have been at least indirect potential causes of death, where ransomware has denied people the ability to get assistance. That was last year. We had a Solarwinds attack. So Solarwinds is an American company. I'll talk a bit more about it later. It does services in particular for the government, but 18,000 organizations. And one of its updates contained a, shall we say, a rather nasty attack. It was a trusted update from a trusted company with certain privileges inside the organizations. And that was effectively a Trojan horse. And I mean that in the general sense, as opposed to the classic software sense. DarkSide, these people who pretended to be Robin Hood at New Year's, right around the end of December last year, they sent out a message to their affiliate network, which sounds a lot like a legitimate company. Some of you have channel partners, for instance, congratulating them on a job well done and meeting targets and quotas. And DarkSide made $90 million US in Bitcoin in a month and a half. So that is a lot of money, not offset by these paltry donations of fractions of Bitcoin on the right. This year, let's take a look at this year. We had SolarWinds at the end of last year. Then we had Hafnium, which was a similar style of attack through Microsoft Exchange and largely using Microsoft tools, which made it seem a little bit more natural as behavior in organizations, but it was another instance of a supply chain attack that came in very early January. We saw the Colonial Pipeline attack, of course, which I described a little bit. Also Kaseya. Now Kaseya was interesting. It is a piece of ransomware delivered as a supply chain attack. It came a little bit later in the year. So right as we're reeling from this wave of ransomware, and we've learned that that these supply chain attacks are more developed than we'd expected, the two get crossed over. And the White House has put out an executive order in the US on cyber, and they've started leveraging some diplomatic channels to apply pressure to countries like Russia, for instance, and with and against countries like China and what have you. So we are seeing now cyber take a global position in international relations again, where it was dormant for a little while. And most recently, the US government has shut down the SUEX crypto exchange. And I didn't put it in here, but China has also said that it is banning use of cryptocurrency as a form of legitimate barter. So just some recent news and events to give you a backdrop. And I thought I'd focus in as well on one of the questions, by the way, was what's the view of the impact of quantum computing and stuff. I'll answer that one a little bit later. And one of the questions was on a supply chain attack. A supply chain attack means that your suppliers upstream have had a compromise of some sort, and their software is used to enter your environment. It's signed, it's trusted, it's behaving in your environment as a known good inside the trust circle piece of software, and that gets exploited. So let's take a look at the impact from ransomware. This is a sample of about 1,200 people. We did a survey. This is explicitly not people targeted by ransomware. It was 1,200 people not selected on that basis. And of them, 2/3 of organizations reported they had lost revenue. A little over half reported brand and reputation damage. 1/3 lost C-level talent, meaning CFO, CTO, CMO, what have you. About a little under 1/3 reported having to lay people off as a result of a ransomware attack. Now that's a little difficult to quantify. So keep in mind, this is interviews of cyber professionals, of folks that do security for a job. And so they have a good perspective, but they didn't quantify it. 80% of those who paid ransoms were attacked again. This is a new development. Ransomware as a service, I used the acronym on the previous slide and should have explained, big R, little a, S, big S, is the almost the specialization in the cartels. It's like the partner network, saying that there are organizations, individuals, and companies whose job is to go pursue victims and deliver them. Now, if you go back 2-3 years, there were cases when ransomware primarily targeted consumers. There were cases of people taking pity on the poor, people who couldn't pay, and very rarely were they attacking twice. Not that there was honor among thieves, but they moved on to new targets. Now, if there's an organization who gets paid by, let's say, DarkSide to deliver victims, that organization has no inhibition from selling that same victim to someone else. So you're part of the pool of people who are attackable, and that shouldn't be a surprise. Just under half of people who paid regained access to their data. But in those instances, some or all of the data was corrupted. And that shouldn't be a surprise. Simply giving data back once it's been encrypted and denied is not easy. It's hard to restart the engine. There's lost information in between when it shut down and now, and much of the data is corrupted. It's not like they put in a special focus on the recovery features or offer support for that, although some actually do. And 42% reported that cyber insurance did not cover all the losses. And in fact, beyond all the losses, you also have to now think that there's lessons learned involved, and you have to improve your practices to avoid being part of the 80% that get attacked again. It can get ugly. Okay, so before we go into the main body of the presentation, I wanted to cover some first principles with you. I'm a physicist by training, and so I like to think of what are things to keep in mind. And the first of these is the chaos theory, and two different kinds of chaos. I first really saw good explanation of this from Harari in his book Sapiens, which I highly recommend. First order chaos is natural systems. It is systems where the threat is adaptive and complex, but it's not intelligently adaptive. Something like a hurricane or a blizzard in the meteorological system. It doesn't change course to attack you based on how you take shelter. COVID-19 is, at least now, it is a first order risk. It doesn't say, for instance, to itself, hey, my host is going through an airport, lower the body temperature so I don't get caught. Second order chaos is intelligently adaptive. And in most businesses, there's only three places that there is intelligent adaptation. One is competition. The enemy is a company with human beings behind it. Two is legal. And three is security, right? The cyber and the InfoSec departments are dealing with intelligent human opponents, and that's different from the classic enemy of nature in IT. Worth keeping that in mind, because it explains why how you have dialogue about it and how you manage it will be different from the rest of IT. Locar's principle. Locard is a 19th century French criminologist. He came up with Locar's exchange principle, which is the theory that whenever a crime is committed, there's an exchange of evidence between the criminal and the crime scene. So if somebody, for instance, gets stabbed or shot, there will be gunpowder residue or blood, in the case of stabbing, on the attacker, but they'll also leave DNA and fingerprints and footprints and dirt samples. Here in the US, the FBI, for instance, keeps dirt samples for every acre of ground in the United States on just available so that it will help narrow down searches. And that's why CSI, crime scene investigation, exists. Now, I mention this because this is a principle we've extended to the cybersecurity world, and it may not be a good extension. There's not necessarily a wake to follow, and there's an awful lot to collect. So keep that in mind as we go ahead. I draw a distinction between IT security and cybersecurity. Keep that in mind in the next couple of slides, because IT security to me deals with security as if it was first order chaos. In other words, we reduce vulnerabilities and we set up multi-factor authentication, the FOBs that Vikas mentioned. Cybersecurity focuses on the human, or one day the AI in the system that is the opponent. And keep those two in mind, because IT security eventually can be managed by an IT department once it's set up and running well. Yes, the opponent is still adaptive, but it's managed as if it was first order chaos. Cybersecurity is where the cyber skills come in and focusing on the enemy. There is asymmetry in cyber conflict. So in other words, the jobs and tools of attack are different from the jobs and tools of defense. And it's worth further mentioning that the attackers are winning more than the defenders are. And the reason for this is the adversary is adapting faster than defensive technologies. It doesn't have to be that way, but it is. And I'll get into why on the next slide a little bit. But what we're dealing with is effectively companies that have mirrored what we do in tech. They have developers and QA, and they have product managers, and they have partners, and they have partner managers, and they have legal departments in some cases. Sometimes they're sheltered by a nation state. Sometimes they're independent or run by organized crime. This is a unique focus on creating tools to break in, and such that we often say the adversary only has to get it right once or very few times, while the defender has to play a perfect game to defend. And I was asked a little bit in my conversations in preparation by Vikas and colleagues to discuss the market. In a world, I will first of all say that something, and this is an important concept, something that is a commodity is something available everywhere, where the quality is the same from everywhere, and then it's only differentiated on price. And what you'll find is historically, if you go back and look at most tech markets, what's happened is you get innovation and great products produced, and then over time they become commodities, at which point there's a consolidation of the market. You go from the world of accounting software to the ERP suites. You go to the CSM suites. But security does something different because as an adaptive opponent, we never truly settle into a point where we've beaten them and innovation is always valuable. And so we go through these probably a Kondratiev wave, but we certainly go through a sine wave where you see the collapse into a few suites like McAfee and Symantec and CA and IBM, for instance, and then the innovators come up and you go back to best of breed. And then there's a collapse and then an expansion. And so cyber behaves a little differently from most markets. It won't forever, but it does for now. So let's talk about I think what's the biggest problem in cybersecurity. The biggest problem today in cybersecurity is not, it is not a technical problem. And I know that may sound strange as most of my experience has been with technical solutions. The biggest problem is a lack of alignment between the security departments and their businesses. And I spend a lot of time talking to the cyber half of that equation saying, learn the language of the business. But I think it's becoming more important that the business side learns the language of cyber. And I don't mean deeply technical. Unfortunately, most people in cyber, and we're going to discuss this as a theme too, they don't make the discipline approachable. We keep it arcane and esoteric, and it is uninviting, to say the least. So if you ask a CFO as they look around the room, what does each of your C-levels want? What do they ask of you? You know, they'll say, well, marketing wants more money to run programs. Everything's about lead gen and brand, and they want to run programs. And engineering always wants more engineers. It's always that quality, time, scope problem given resources. So they always want more resources. Then they go to the security person. And the security person says, if you ask the CFO, they say, I want toys. The CFO says the security officer wants toys. There's always a new thing coming out that they want. And there's this lack of understanding between the two sides. The result is this pyramid you see in front of you, or half pyramid. Most of the spend in security is low in the stack. And it's because they don't enable the reduction in payment down there. What happens is somebody from the CFO's office comes in and says, hey, budget time's coming up, and we have to do your budget. And the CSO goes, oh no. And so then they said, don't worry, I make it easy. I took your budget last year, moved it forward, we have to shave 10% off. And the cybersecurity officer says, I have an adaptive opponent. I need new tools. And what they hear in the CFO's office is, I need new toys. And so the discretionary spend at the top of the pyramid is very, very small. The ideal state, however, is to invert this pyramid. And the only way to do that is if you have a principle by which you say to your CFO or your business counterparts as a security person, or a security person seeking a business person seeking a dialogue with a security person, is give me a principle by which to reduce the spend on commodities and what to invest in. What's the value back to the business? And my argument is that would actually be cyber value. So I mentioned it's a difficult space to get into. The industry is too arcane. It is difficult for smart business people, technical counterparts to approach. It's also very difficult for people to get into. I have described this to some of my colleagues as the ladder in cyber is available, but the first rung is 6 feet off the ground. And we've got to do more, I think, to make this accessible. We haven't done any favors to ourselves, right? Popular media makes it seem unapproachable. We have acronyms everywhere, and I even am guilty of that so far in this presentation. But I think we need to do more to make things simple and understandable. I'm not talking about dumbing it down. I am occasionally talking about analogy, but my experience is if somebody in cyber, or in any discipline for that matter, can't explain something simply, they probably don't really understand it, or they don't have any patience, is the other possibility. So I think fixing this divide is about establishing dialogue. And my advice to CISOs, CISOs, Chief Information Security Officers generally, is get to know the language of the business and realize your job is not to be the smartest security person anymore. Your job is a C-level. That means logistics. That means dialogue with peers, aligning with the business. And I know many of you are on the business side of this divide. The reverse is true too. Ask the CISO to explain something and have a chat about what is the impact to your business and to your mission and your financial goals. So switching gears a little bit, I thought I'd talk about one attack that's illustrative of many problems. And I've summarized some of the takeaways in the lower left. This attack was called SoftCell, SOFTCELL, like soft cellular. And it was the attack of a telco that's in over 20 countries. And later we found out during the investigation, they were likely after 20 former Chinese dissidents who had left China. And what they did to get there was steal the call data records of every subscriber, millions of people. And this is the data that's used to construct billing information. But if you have a lot of, say, big data capacity, if you have really good ML, you train this sort of thing, you can use it to understand the social networks and the privacy related things. Who's calling whom, when, how, where are they, who went to the doctor, who went for a prescription, who is cheating on whom perhaps, or who's making a side deal. All of that's inferable from this data. So we went into this telco and we installed, and within about a day, we were seeing the traffic. And this attacker went through 4 distinct waves of fighting back. In the old days, the attackers would go like submarines. They'd go silent running and try to avoid being caught. Now they are resisting, they're pushing back. And there was a few reasons this happened. One is that the decision loop to take actions was slower than the ability for the attacker to expand and move to new areas. So it was very difficult for this telco to make a decision to get rid of them. And this was highly adaptive. And the points that I'm going to make here is if you look, first wave, top bullet says web shell. Third wave, top bullet says new web shell. That's interesting. That's an entirely new product being used on their side. And what we saw was almost, actually it was agile, the result of agile development and about 2-week sprints and 1-month builds. Eventually they were kicked out, but efficiency here is as important as quality. Making the analysts scale is important. Making sure that people who are fighting this can do so at scale. Getting the intelligence to the human beings mattered, and in making sure the business could make decisions instead of it having to be an analyst to security management to senior management. Can we shut this down? Should we shut this down? And then the decision comes down and you do it 3 days later. Shortening that cycle. And OODA loop is from the US military and the Air Force. It stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. Act is fast. Act is the fastest thing, and yet that's what we spend all of our time discussing. The hard part is understanding impact and making decisions. And if that's taking days, the attackers are going to spread. So let's talk a little bit about telemetry. I mentioned Local earlier, and that's about getting to data. And in our industry and security, there's something we call the pyramid of pain. What do we use as a primary source of data to find attackers, to find the bad guys? David Bianco came up with this. You can look him up. In the pyramid of pain, things at the bottom are easy to get, and we rely on across the industry. Hash values of files and tools where you crunch it, and if it's the same tool, it comes out the same every time. Incredibly common. However, over 30% of the IOCs that we use are planted by the opponents. They do it to mislead us and send us off on wild goose chases. The other thing is that some of these hash values I've seen in a given progression of an attacker, we call it a kill chain. In a given progression, very often the tool used on machine A is the same as on machine B, but it's been slightly modified so that the hash changes radically. A quality of hashes is that any change leads to a radical change in output. And so you can't use the hash from machine A to find it on machine B. What's more is the attackers know where they've dropped every unique hash. They themselves hash it. And what that means is if you go check a repository like VirusTotal, Reversing Labs, and say, has anyone seen this? They're in those communities. And the minute you ask the question, you're telling them inadvertently which machine you found them on. And so it can actually work against you. now. And then as you move up the stack, these get more valuable, but they get harder. And right up at the top is TTPs. This stands for tactics, techniques, and processes, or actually practices. This is the actions and activities of the attacker. Very hard to get to. And one of my theses here is going to be that this is where we should be focusing, rather than relying on the bottom. That's trivial and easy to get, but possibly just not very valuable and possibly detrimental. We need to be getting up to what are the actions and activities in an environment and developing languages there and protocols. So to summarize the technical challenge, we did the business challenge. These are the issues. The noise to signal ratio is bad because of Locale's principle applied to networks and systems. It's hard to get to the top of that pyramid of pain. It's hard to find new things like ransomware and supply chain attacks. And this notion of changing or unique indicators of compromise, the stuff at the bottom, the hashes, and of course, supply chain issues generally. So the mission, I think, for cybersecurity departments is enrich the data, collect the data, enrich it, but at the same time, don't get too much of it. You've got to refine to the actual data that you need, be able to stop this notion of 0 days, attacks that have been developed and used never before, and what's called living off the land, which is the earlier form of supply chain compromise. It is when I arrive, rather than bring a tool, I'll use what IT has planted there. You'll use PowerShell, you'll use the Office suite because it's present and it's ubiquitous in the organization and it's powerful. And now this latest stuff I mentioned at the beginning, the supply chain attacks, and something I actually prefer the term ransom ops. I'm only going to use it here. Ransom operations rather than ransom software. In your mind, you should not be thinking of ransomware as just software. It is a delivery mechanism like the advanced nation states attacks, whose payload is malicious software. In other words, they move stealthily through networks, plant bombs all over the place, try to get everywhere where information exists, because if they leave anything behind, you can survive, and then simultaneously detonate, time on target. They all blow up and encrypt at the same time, and preferably at a time of their choosing. Like one customer I spoke to had, prior to coming on board with us, he'd had Friday night, 11:59 p.m., 6 of his 7 data centers were encrypted. The 7th, the attackers didn't know about because it was not stood up yet. And that was the sole reason they survived, because it was not in the normal loop, but it had copies of data. So let's get to TTPs, the top, getting to where the real action is. So let's first describe what the job of IT is. And my apologies to CIOs if I'm oversimplifying here, but the job of IT is to enable connections. It is in fact to take users and their machines and connect over networks to clouds to use apps and interact with data. The arrows in this loop is the purpose of IT. And one of the reasons that security gets in the way is we slow this down by nature. But so what do the attackers do? They want to abuse these connections. They want to hide in them. They don't want to be leaving things like tools and things in their wake and signatures and things that can be hashed to find them. They want to use the infrastructure as it is. This is using the supply chain attack, the trusted software, using the present software in an organization and abusing it. So effectively, I'm going to argue that rather than the Locale's principle applied to logs, for instance, which is the records of what every security function or noteworthy security event is. And there's a rule in security, for instance, everyone has some variant of this in their company if they're mature. 3 failed logins blocks an account, up to 6 failed logins, depending on the sensitivity. But that's pointless. I mean, yes, you need it for compliance, and yes, you should report on it and know about it. But that was based on an era where people used to brute force passwords and try to guess them. They don't do that now. They go directly for the passwords through phishing or finding artifacts on systems. They actually will succeed on the first try. And so I actually don't care about failed logins as much. I do a little bit, but I care much more about successful logons. And that's what's being articulated on the right. So I don't know how many of you may have seen this. This is not meant to be an eye test. This is, in my opinion, the best articulation currently of what bad guys do and how they do it. And I mention this because this is evolving. This is one of the most interesting trends in defense. The columns here are the milestones or stages of an attack. It starts with initial access and goes to execution and persistence. At the end, you'll see exfiltration and impact, and they're even adding now cleanup. Each box is the action or activity that could be done by an attacker. But the dirty secret here is that some of these boxes are sometimes benign. In fact, most of them. One of the boxes here is ICMP related, it's ping. And ping is used by the IT staff. It isn't inherently bad. So if you look here, there's two different actors who are partly related. They share some code. Carbonac and Fin7 are both cyber criminals. The blue is Carbonac, the red is Fin7, and yellow is what they do that's common from a toolkit perspective. MITRE, as an organization, not only maintains this taxonomy and this description and advances it quite regularly, they maintain libraries of known attacker patterns. And the trick I'm going to say is, rather than in security, we say in this moment, is something good or bad? And if we say it's good and we're wrong, then something bad happens to an organization. If we say it's bad and we're wrong, business is interrupted. But rather than focus on that moment, we should be thinking of chains of behavior. And at some point, the chain turns bad. And I want to emphasize that because that's how we're going to record this, regardless of product. Regardless of whether you're an endpoint product, a network product, a cloud product, you want to be capturing in a grammar what are the actions and activities rather than everything in an environment. If something spawns something, like Outlook spawns Excel, or it injects, like you clicked on a URL in Outlook and it went into Safari or Explorer, that you changed privileges. And that's the sort of thing we should be keeping, that there's less of that data than just get everything. And we can look now as an industry to build new standards, better data structures, preserving context and relationships. And it has a lot of benefits, everything from cheaper storage to better noise to signal ratio, as we said. Now, I mentioned I'd talk about Solarwinds. This is where I'll do that. The Solarwinds attack, Solarwinds is a company that was compromised upstream, and it had a product called Orion, which was a network product, and it got an update, a signed, trusted update that had been compromised upstream by an attacker. And what it did was it loaded a DLL. It took a body of code, a library, and loaded it, and then did nothing for 2 weeks. The reason it did nothing is it was just waiting dormantly to see, have I been caught? And side loading of DLLs happens all the time. It can happen legitimately. Then it phoned home, it reached out, and applications do that all the time. In this case, there was a small chance somebody would have recognized it was a domain generation algorithm, a trick that the attackers used to avoid their command and control being compromised, but probably not. It pulled a file down, it executed the file, there was a change of privilege, and there was lateral communication. Any single step here could be and has a strong chance of being benign. But the chain, by the time you get to the third or fourth step, is invariably bad. Admins don't behave this way, users don't behave this way. Admins do not arrive on your machine, reach out to an email address outside, load it up, execute it, and change privilege. They don't do that. They change privilege in other ways. They bring files from other places. And that's my point. That's what we have to be capturing. And I'm calling this indicators of behavior. It is behavioral telemetry. It is not anomalies or correlations, but it can be used for these things. And it is instrumentable in many different places. I'm actually pushing for a standard with OASIS that is vendor neutral. And it is really a description language. I should be able to say, I have seen behavior that has A and then B near C, and share that with anyone, and they should be able to go look for it, regardless of the kit they use in security. This is the kind of innovation that is lacking and that can actually change the game and some of the asymmetry and cyber conflict to favor us. So we're approaching the end of the presentation. I know some of you are on the business side and saying, so, Sam, you've told me about this gap. What should I ask tomorrow of my security personnel? And I put a few questions. The first is relatively easy and obvious. What are the biggest risks to the organization in cyber? You don't want someone coming to justify their existence or just share random metrics. A risk-based discussion is the way to go. Just as you would talk about sales risk, legal risk, operational risk, financial risk, you should be talking about cyber risk. Next is, what are commodities that we could reduce, not eliminate, spend? The bottom of my earlier pyramids, I will never throw that stuff out, or maybe very rarely. It's still there. It's just not the focus anymore. It's not the thing that should be the lion of cybersecurity. Antivirus or security information event management, they're necessary, but they're not the stars. They're not the top of my pyramid because they're older and they're less good at finding the new techniques. So you can ask the question, what could we get the spend down on to free the spend up for new things? And you could actually take these slides, I'm happy to share them, and say to your cyber counterparts, hey, Sam Curry spoke to me and showed me this. Do you agree? And if they say yes, you say, well, how do we flip it? How can I help you do that? Are you getting behavioral telemetry? As I mentioned, behavior is the way to go from vendors. If the answer is yes, fantastic. They should see if they've heard of the standard. But if not, then it's probably a good criteria for them to start getting more better noise to signal ratio, finding the stuff that seems unstoppable. You can stop ransomware this way in its spreading phase. You can stop the supply chain attacks. What should be included that you aren't including today? What is the strategy for supply chain attacks? Because I mentioned that, and ransomware attacks. So I did promise some predictions, and then we'll go to the Q&A. A warning, these are opinions, so they're mine. And if you take issue with them, I have no problem. I would love a dialogue. So for attackers, here's what I think is going to happen in the new year. And most of this is extrapolating from what's come before, including innovation patterns. So I think nation states, we're going to lean on cyber even more. There's a word in English that I didn't believe existed, optionality. It just sounds like an inelegant word. It's a real word, and you can Google it. It means having lots of options. And so nation states, nobody wants to turn up to the head of a nation state and say, and he or she says, so what are my options? And they're told one thing or two things. They are developing options primarily through cyber and advancing the cyber toolkit because it makes sense. Cybercrime keeps growing and uses that toolkit fastest. The nation state toolkits are getting distributed to cyber criminals. We're seeing this in a lot of different countries. The lines between the actors are becoming blurred. We had an instance where most of the community was convinced a particular form of attack was the Chinese government because of the MO of how they were operating, but the motive made no sense. The modus operandi, that was clear. The tools were the same, in fact, to a stark degree. And then we realized collectively that somebody was moonlighting and making money in the evenings. More supply chain attacks and ransomware. And I think new tech, new targets, as the system gets more diverse and rich, we're going to see IoT attacked, OT, and autonomous systems like cars. Defenders, I think the talent gap's going to get worse. We're not making a friendly space, even though we have more cyber graduates. And when I became a cyber person, there was no bachelor's in it, let alone a PhD. Even though we're producing more, the gap is still enormous. And I think most security departments could get more agile. I did a presentation at MIT Lincoln Labs at 600 people in the room for various organizations. I said, how many of you come from an organization that has agile principles? This is 4 years ago, it may have changed, in the R&D department, and every hand shot up. And I said, now how many of you do this, follow agile in your security department? 3 hands stayed in the air. That is probably better, but I bet it's not 100%. Emphasis should be on adaptation, the rate of improvement. And I think that's going to come out in the metrics a bit more. And my stretch is to use indicators of behavior and to help the new OASIS standard. And in the industry, more regulations in government, the executive order from what happens is the most mature industries get regulations first, and then they trickle down through other verticals. It goes from defense industrial base and government usually for cyber to financial services to healthcare, et cetera, retail, and goes down. And the other regulations tend to pick that up, and they get copied among nations as well. I still think we're going to see now there's not just a vendor bill of materials for security. There's also concern that maybe people will be liable for security issues and vulnerabilities. I can see a lot of vendors getting blamed for attacks, even though it's much more complex than any one vendor can solve. Cyber insurance confidence issues are big. There are a number of companies that have tried to not pay in the insurance world, and that hasn't gone well. Premiums are up. The most recent data I saw was about 35% in cost, and payouts are way up. In a second order chaos system, it's very difficult to build an actuarial table. That's the struggle, because you can't say, for instance, hey, if you want to avoid flooding, do this. And we've tested it, and it's 99.9% likely to work. And it does work that way across the population, because the bad guys adapt in a way that floods don't, or fire. I expect you'll see some big IPOs. I think there'll be doubt expressed by investors in sustainability, but the CrowdStrikes of the world, the Sentinel ones, my own Cybereason has been making noises there. Darktrace, other companies are getting a lot of attention, and multiples are huge. The value, however, is going to be persistent because of that pendulum effect I talked about earlier. And I expect you're going to see a wave of consolidation and acquisitions, and then a bounce as more innovative companies come up the stack. There may be a bubble effect going on, but it does have sustainable value. So last thing before Q&A, some of my pet peeves. There's too many buzzwords out there, and some of these are really important. Some of them are not so much. Blockchain, very important technology. Very often it's in security, it's just hiding somebody trying to seem like a better mousetrap. I don't like when people end an explanation as because blockchain. It might as well be because magic. Blockchain has some wonderful qualities, but I think it's going to take a time to find the problems they uniquely solved, as opposed to just using blockchain for its own sake. So Gartner has this hype cycle that starts with initially massive hype, and I apologize if this is reversed as I move my hand, and then it comes down and gets disappointing, and then it becomes productive. And I think that blockchain's on the downstroke in cyber. It may not be in other industries, so be careful. AI is enormous as a space and very important, and has a lot of applications in security. Most of the time when it's used, people mean machine learning, which is, of course, part of the AI toolkit. Nobody has yet solved the Turing challenge, and such an intelligence has not said, gee, I just want to be a cyber person or a cyber intelligence. We don't yet have AIs battling each other, but we do have AI components assisting the battle with each other. There's intelligence in security and in offense as well as defense. It's just carbon-based. And right now, it's mostly machine learning that's helping. And so machine learning on that hype cycle has reached what's called the plateau of productivity. It's delivering results. It is making a difference now in places like identity and access, in endpoint detection, in analysis of logs. It is getting things that help and improve efficiency. So I kind of like that one, but people don't much anymore. It feels a little boring to folks. XDR, this is the new one. It's climbing the hype curve. This is really the placeholder of this generation of technology for how to stop the bad guys, how to do cyber. It used to be held by SIM, Security Information Event Management. That went through a SIM, next-gen SIM or SIM 2.0. Then EDR stepped up. But as each of these has become defined and delivered value, we still quest after the ability to stop the human opponent. This is now the placeholder for that. It too will become more concretely defined and get to the plateau of productivity. But another one will emerge, I believe, afterwards to define still that receding desire to find the 1U rack mountable or web service call that can solve security. And zero trust. I'm not a fan of this term because, I mean, it sounds good, but the main reasons aren't that it isn't a good state to get to. It's that nobody has really thought about what it ultimately means. It means no a priori trust or relationships. That circle I showed you earlier, the purpose of IT, would say those arrows don't exist until you ask for them, and only for as long as they're needed, and they're continuously verified, which itself is a difficult challenge. And then afterwards, you can go and audit it. If you did that, if you just jumped to zero trust in an environment, you would make all of your CIOs extremely angry and probably interrupt a lot of business. And if you do it prematurely, all you're doing is moving the attack surface to the authorization and provisioning layer for that. So I prefer the term least trust. I have a zero trust project, which is every 6 months, I ask of my architects and contribute to the company and say, how do we get less trust? It's like least function and least privilege. That's interesting. It's like a limit in calculus. I care about how can I get closer to zero trust rather than buying a zero trust from someone. And if you disagree with that, I'm totally okay with it. I think it's a wonderful idea, but it should be a guiding principle, not a thing we think we're buying. Okay, so Vikas, I will now open it up to Q&A. I see we've got a few questions teed up.
Yes, wow,
hopefully
Sam.
This was interesting to people.
That was a lot of information condensed in such a short time.
I think I hit 40 minutes for you.
Thank you.
Roughly.
Thank you. I appreciate that. If you could just switch off. Yeah, wonderful. So I see that there are a lot of questions. So what we can do is people had submitted a bunch of questions beforehand that we had shared with you. So maybe
do you want to address the ones in the QA, or do you want to start with
also? So let's do one each, right?
Okay.
You pick one question from here from the Q&R, Q&A?
For this one, let's do, what's your view of the impact of quantum computing? I'm just going to take them in order because
Yep, that's
Marcel
fine.
is, he got
And I'll
there
do the
first,
same thing
right?
on this side.
Yeah, so I believe quantum computing has a massive ability to affect both offense and defense. The ability to collapse down and most of crypto, by the way, is a problem easy to do in one direction and hard to do in the reverse, like the multiplication of large prime numbers, easy. Factoring the product of large prime numbers, hard. Not infinitely hard, but hard. Same thing's true of elliptic curve when you use an elliptic curve or other mechanisms. Quantum crypto overnight will change that. But the ability to do things like provision using quantum entanglement is amazing, right? And the ability for us to say, one of the reasons we use asymmetric encryption at all is because the distribution of symmetric keys is a challenge. That could become trivial using quantum entanglement. And so I think most of what I've seen here is hype. We should be investing now in more quantum-proof things like random number generation and crypto. I used to be a cryptanalyst and a cryptographer. I don't see enough emphasis on it, but the stubs are there and we should encourage it. It seems like doing crypto for its own sake right now, but it will be very important down the road. And the other thing I want to mention is when somebody finally breaks a large RSA key, it's not the end of the world. Most of these techniques are based on brute force, and the systems by which you verify these things, they exist. It's lowering the cost to break something enormously, but it doesn't make all crypto invalid overnight, which is the hype I've seen. Marcel, I hope that addressed it for you.
Thanks, Sam. Sam, there's a lot of discussion about different kinds of technologies, as you pointed out in your half pyramid, right? But many a times it's out of bounds of smaller and mid-sized and even mid to large-sized companies, right, who don't have the resources. So what's your advice there?
My advice is that security is it's not binary, it's a continuum. And you can focus on being healthy and having a healthy rate of improvement and adaptation, even without having to go buy all the legacy stuff. So what I mean by I sat next to my last trip before COVID, it was to South Africa, and I sat next to a CSO of a very small company with 4 people. And even that's a lot for some people. And I said to him, what did you focus on first? He said, well, I said, SIM was going to be an afterthought for me, and I focused on EDR first. And he goes, I've grown now to 4 people. He says, I still don't need SIM. One day I might need it for compliance, or I might need it for a unique class of threat. There's about a dozen use cases for it, but it's not important to me. So he didn't inherit the baggage of a bigger company or an older company. So I would encourage, first of all, focus on first principles, get good at exercising cyber skills, use your IT department as much as you can, and use both services. So look for managed services and make sure you have advisors and look for peers that you can pool resources with. So who could you talk to regionally or in your vertical and say, hey, what are your techniques? Could we use a common vendor together? Municipalities, for instance, do this now. That they're turning and saying, well, we're not in competition with each other. So why don't we pool our resources and buy a decent access to decent consultants and common services that we could share for our 3-4 cities?
Got it. Okay, thanks. Why don't you pick one from here?
All right, so Doris, is a cloud solution more secure against cyber attacks compared to company-run servers? This is a wonderful question. And I'm going to answer it as I did when asked by the press on this question once. I said, absolutely more secure most of the time, for a while, a little bit, and then never. And what I meant by that was most companies that move to the cloud will immediately gain efficiencies and their security will go up. But abdicating security is a bad idea, because the more companies that go to the cloud, the more attractive cracking those cloud services become. Think of it as a fraction. The numerator is the attractiveness of the target, and the denominator is the difficulty of breaking it. I sometimes say the best proxy for security is cost to break. It's a financial thing we can understand. And so when you move to the cloud, your denominator gets big. But as that numerator grows, it makes sense for the attackers who are vested interests to start to break them. And that's what you'll see. You'll see immediately it's great, and then it's a little worse, and then it's about the same, and eventually it gets much worse. And that's why you shouldn't abdicate, because you should always be able to repossess your security, and you should be able to vote with your feet and switch providers, because then you can put pressure on them to stay current and increase that cost to break in the denominator. I hope that helps, Doris.
Thanks, Sam. So there's a question from somebody at a board level. How do you prevent risk at the board level? What kind of discussions should I be having?
Well, for most companies, the board role is very different from officers, right? And what an audit committee should be doing and a risk committee should be doing is ensuring the right processes exist and the right indicators of good and bad results are being created. Sometimes the professionals themselves don't know. So one thing, I sit on 3 boards, and the temptation for me is to always come in and say, oh, do it this way. And I don't, right? And so what I do instead is I come and visit and I spend time. It's a little harder now, but I'll do coffee sessions in Zoom. And I'm saying, I just want to, first of all, I want them to not be scared of me. There's a healthy amount of respect always for board members, and there should be. But what I want is, I want them to be talking about what they're thinking and not worried about proving they're intelligent or that they know their trade. And that kind of trust is super important. I think it's more of a literally leadership role with no management. And so the best way to have conversations there is to make it a risk conversation all the way. If you're getting too granular, there's a problem. The other thing is, I sometimes advise cyber professionals when talking to the board, identify the technical person. I have it's Cybereason, there's one guy on my board who is into the weeds. And so I take him out for coffee or dinner and go through all of it. And then when I talk to the board, I put up one picture and tell a story. And when I say, by the way, your appendix contains all the information, some will have read it, some won't, they all look at that guy. And if he's nodding, then they trust it. And that's not a way to get past them. It's how you manage the people. The reverse is true too. The board can say, hey, Sam, why don't you go and get to know the details for us and come back and tell us? But it depends on the maturity of the board and the degree to which they understand what their role should be.
Understood. Thanks.
All right.
Okay, so
Yves Poulet has, what are the prerequisites to successfully implement indicators of behavior? How much is it used already by companies? It's a great question. It depends. I've seen it more commonly used in EDR vendors, but we're starting to see it emerge in network detection tools and in SIM. Folks are looking to extract the metadata that indicates what are the actions and activities happening. But directly measuring it's important, and being able to interact with it on that plane, and the data structures are important. The most critical thing is it's, again, not binary. You can begin to do it, and focusing on it is important rather than just like zero trust jumping to the end state. So in my own practice, I use almost 60 different security tools from third parties. Even though my company manufactures one, I still consume them. On the RFPs, I ask them, who can I contact, and tell me about how you're getting more behavioral analytics and telemetry into your systems. It gives them a chance to put something, or to just say open to a discussion, and then I'll get on the phone and talk to them. But then again, I think people know that I push that as I authored the standard, and although it's not finished.
So I'm going to slide one question in here, Sam.
Go for it.
When you talk about indicators of behavior and when you see an anomaly, what is the time in which a good solution should be able to catch the anomaly or a deviation of behavior?
So the answer depends on how advanced the attack is. So if you're catching it, we say far to the left. So imagine, I don't know if I'm being reversed, but on the left side, the attacker gets in, just like in the attack framework. In that time frame, you usually have days to respond. If you get it in the middle, you've got hours. And if you get it at the end, you've got seconds to minutes. And so the goal isn't just to increase or decrease the response time, which is critical. I think like a good program should be able to find things within a minute or two and respond within 10 to 30 minutes. However, that's useless to you if you catch it on the right. So you've also got to catch it further to the left, and you've got to make it actionable. Simply detecting is useless if you can't take action. So the solution is, yes, a tool, but also what processes do you put around it, and do you have people on staff, and in an emergency, can you scale to do more than one? The RSA breach, for instance, we had 2 attackers going after us at the same time. So how would you handle 2,
Yeah.
3, 4, as well as the distraction events?
Understood. So there are two related questions over here from
Mhm.
what was submitted. What companies make easy targets, and then how do you avoid a cyber attack?
The companies that make easy targets is well, the ones that typically have less mature cyber. And now what we're finding is those whose footprint is growing in an unmanaged way very quickly. I've noticed energy sector getting really badly attacked, and it's less vertically oriented than sometimes size of company. We're back to an earlier question. So the other point that I think is crucial to make is you may not be targeted because the generation of exploits is now done in an automated way. The internet, as you know, is effectively a number line, and you can scan segments of it, and it's public knowledge which segments have what company types. And so what the attackers do is they automate the scanning and they ingest the noticed vulnerabilities. They have ML from past experience saying, oh, try these attacks, and then using it with no human in the loop. And in the morning, the hacker gets up and goes to his or her computer and sees a list of, here's the one most likely to pay, developed for you to go and do your hacking trick on.
Yep.
And they start there and they go down. It's the most profitable thing. And so one thing I often say to companies is whether or not you think you're being targeted or have reason to justify that, you still now have to protect yourself as if you were.
So there's a third part to this question is obvious. How do you defend against that, right? Because there is a big asymmetry. How do I get my CISO team to act faster?
Yeah, this is where I often advise both CISO teams and those who manage them. You have to separate the IT security function from the cyber function. And I don't like red teaming. Like, I'm not a fan of it because I'll give you an example. If there was a basketball game and I showed you one play, right? Think of basketball. Somebody has the ball, they run up the court, they try to get a basket. And I stop the tape and say, who's the better team? You can't tell from just one. Anyone could make a basket or fail. You have to see more plays to start to answer that question. And to answer who's going to win the season, you have to see more games. So I prefer red teaming that's frequent and not to bayonet the wounded, not to test, but rather to help inform the defenders, and something called purple teaming. So I want to be super careful when you test. It's not to find who's incompetent. It is saying, let's help you be more competent. Let's give you the feedback loop and the engineering resources. Like a head of engineering can sit down with a head of R&D and say, I notice you don't have any developers. Could I build something with one of my squads that could make your job easier, and I don't have to then have all these requirements over on the engineering side? That's a dialogue very rarely happens.
Yep, got it. Let's look at Perni's question.
Perni says, my company is very concerned with cyber risk to the extent that everything becomes very complicated. What are the questions to ask? Where the real risk is? Switch to the. So I think I answered this one because this came right before my questions. Perni, if that didn't, feel free to ask it again, but I'll mark that one answered. Should we go to another one of these?
Yes.
Jap says, Jap Demare, is there a silver bullet, a way to have security by design in a way that IT is principally safe? I'm not a fan of any silver bullet approach. I once had, and I alluded to this earlier, I had a CIO once say, when am I going to have my security solution? Give me a price tag for that. And I said, yeah, when are we going to have world peace and solve, hunger worldwide? I want it. Like, I want the same thing. I would rather be, by the way, not dealing with cyber and work in engineering, because as you'll know, I've been a CTO and built things, but I'm passionate about getting to the world where that's true. I don't think we're there yet, Jop. I wish there was, but security by design is something we can get much, much better at. And I don't think there's enough of it in our engineering teams. There's still a security is the department that's going to say no to me. So let's see if I can get this done without getting caught. And I don't blame them. They've got a date. They've got, quality and scope to worry about, a number of resources they can bring to bear. And then they go, oh, Sam's in the way, right? Or whoever the CISO is. The other one is privacy by design. And I think what we've got to do is involve the architects who aren't security people and really get them to realize that they're going to have less security debt later, less overall tech debt. and that they may have a competitive advantage if they do this, but it will require a lot of convincing.
Got it. How do you see nation states as defenders developing? There is a lot of talk about that. Is there a point where this goes beyond what companies are reasonably responsible for?
Yeah, so I think there's two parts to this question. The first is nation states and their development activities in support of the dark side. Is that how you read that, Vikas? Yeah.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is this has been going on for a very long time. In briefings I used to get from various governments, they used to do an XY axis, and they would show flags of who was the most mature in offensive capability. And they had similarly who was most mature in defensive capability. Most nations have specialization in their agencies among these, and many agencies in some cases. But it's been happening a long time. Iran in the late 2000s used to publish toolkits and open source them to get the cyber criminal community to use them, so that in the event of a crisis, they would have options, that optionality word. They did it in something called Operation Ababil. And the now nearly 10 years later, Operation Ababil was a DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service, to flood Wall Street and shut the banks down. It's believed now the Russians paid the Iranians to compromise cyber criminals and turn those into garbage cannons to flood Wall Street. That's an awfully complex ecosystem, but now it's become more formalized. And the distribution of tools is almost instantaneous for some classes of weapons from government labs and attackers to the hacking sphere. Others are kept in reserve, almost like a strategic reserve of delivery mechanisms and payloads. So I think that's going to continue. Now, the second part of the question, could you repeat that? There was another part.
So is there a point where it goes beyond what companies are reasonably responsible for?
Yeah, but I don't
like
think
in the colonial time, right?
Yeah, I actually don't believe we've reached the point where companies take enough responsibility yet. And I think companies could do a lot more. I'm a little leery, though. I have one fellow board member who tells me that there should be criminal penalties for security vulnerabilities, and companies should be liable. And I said, oh, great. If you want to kill the tech sector and have no innovation, go right ahead. But and you'll have a black market, by the way, and people buying software from places that don't have those laws. So I think that's impractical. But I think companies could be doing a lot more. And there's a direct trade-off, right? I mean, if a CISO asks a CIO, can we do this? They're saying, would you mind more tickets and slower response times and missing SLAs? And if you talk to the engineers, you say, do you mind producing less features because you're doing my stuff? And that's a real trade-off, but it should be more than it is right now. And right now, the main pressure on companies is rate of feature improvement and value to the customer. And the question is, how much damage are you doing when you do that? And it could be better.
Got it. So let's look at the question from Eve. Eve is pretty busy or curious. On the lack of common language between business, including C-suite, board, and cyber executives, what's your advice for both to move towards each other? So business gets a better understanding of cyber and vice versa. So
I had the same problem years ago when trying to get senior executives to understand. So what should your product managers be doing for you? It is a question of cyber literacy, and I don't think it's particularly hard. I usually advise the security folks to learn the language of business and be their own translation engine. But as I said, now that I'm talking to some business people, I will say, there are some pretty good certificate programs. There's some workshops you can do to gain basic cyber literacy. You don't have to know how a buffer overflow attack works, or how a cipher works, or be able to do an XOR, or even understand networking, to understand the ideas and concepts in cyber and the players. I'm sure INSEAD has access to curricula, but my own Nichols College, which you mentioned earlier, I'm doing my master's at, or even places like Duke have free courses online where I will be doing my PhD, that are cyber certificates, and they're not coding, and it is very approachable. It's one course is understanding the threat environment, right? This is understanding human beings in political science, really. Another one is understanding, so what are these tools in defense that are used? What is a firewall? What is antivirus? And I think that's super important.
Sounds good. So let's look at another question from the ones that were submitted before.
Yeah.
Somebody from the automotive industry is asking, what is the risk of autonomous vehicles and how do we secure against that?
Well, we're already seeing it being done with drones. That it's a lot like edge computing. That there's autonomous fail modes that aren't catastrophic, and so drones now, because on the battlefield, drones can be compromised through cyber. They have an ability to shield themselves from comms and from interference, and be able to operate autonomously and still fulfill the mission. So, I don't think there's one answer for this one, Vikas. I think it's going to be several. It's a combination of multiple redundancies, using the tricks in the AI toolkit to have edge compute be able to take over with absolute lack of connectivity. My nightmare is that there's a genetically non-diverse population in the code out there, that it makes large fleets of vehicles susceptible to like one exploit. It gets used, and every car, let's say in New York, is told accelerate to 60 miles an hour for 5 seconds and then turn left. I mean, that would be atrocious. But I think those are the sorts of things we can build redundancy into, but it's going to take some planning and architecture.
Understood.
There's another one from Eve, who very engaged. What's your opinion on who the CISO should report to at the executive level and possibly at the board level? So I report to a CEO, and I read out to the board every month. That's not usual. The traditional place is coming up through the CIO. But I will say this, if the only dialogue the CISO is having is with the CIO, that company's in trouble. I've seen it report to general counsel. I've seen it report to the CFO, and I've seen it report to the board. In fact, companies that have been attacked multiple times tend to have it be a board reporting position. It starts to look more like a fiduciary responsibility than it does a classic C-level. And so it makes sense. I believe ultimately it will be a board reporting thing. And these are truly risk management positions. They're not really IT positions. You'll notice most of what I talked about today didn't get very technical. The most was the indicators of behavior. It is rooted in technology, but so is everything these days. So I would say it can report to any number of places. CEO is great. I'm actually the highest ranking infrastructure executive. The CIO actually reports to me, which is a hallmark of a newer company because we're 8 years old.
Yeah. So there's another question over here. What is the kind of toolkit that a NED or an independent director should have when he sits on a board, right? To be reasonably protected. Now, there must be some kind of director's liability or something that.
I believe this is covered for the most part with director's liability. It will depend on the country and incorporation. It's different, for instance, here in the United States than in the other jurisdictions I've served on boards like the Nordics. Most of it doesn't have jurisprudence around cyber specifically, meaning under US common law, the trial history actually matters a lot to future interpretations, at least in theory. And the same is true in the UK. It's different though in the Napoleonic system and in civil courts and things like that. So I would ask that question of your general counsel. I love throwing that back at them and saying, get me an answer. And then they go and they do their proper research because I'm not a lawyer. But I would, my general experience is that it's not carved out distinctly in a universal way.
Thanks. So let's look at Jack's question. What are the key questions the board needs to ask in terms of cybersecurity in general, and also specifically once an attack takes place?
Well, once an attack takes place, it's roll up your sleeves time and start doing. And at that point, the question board members should ask is, what are your priorities and how you're going to do triage and how can I help? And board members have the kind of clout usually that can make a big difference. They have peers and they have other organizations they can call on. They're typically statesmen and stateswomen who can do unnatural things. And the security folks rarely think of that. They don't go, oh, my chairman of the board knows the head of Google, and we use Google Cloud. Gee, maybe I should call her and see if she can help me. So I think it is ask what, what are your priorities and what can you do? Beforehand is where the big questioning should happen. And really what you want to do is to make sure the program is self-improving, that tests are happening, that risks are objectively being reviewed and outside perspectives are being sought. So I have a set of peers, about a dozen CSOs. Whenever I do a risk assessment, I have NDAs in place with them, and I review their risks and they review mine. And we open the kimono a little bit because I need them to be going, did you think of this, Sam? And I do the same for them. So that's what I would recommend. Yeah.
Understood. So how different are cyber issues amongst companies, Sam? Is there a taxonomy that can be applied to a segment or a cluster of companies according to cyber risks? I haven't seen anything, but maybe.
No, but there's a general structure and set of cadences that are good. The way the org chart looks isn't going to vary very much. I actually advised a CISO just this morning, and he said, what are your departments? And I said, this. He goes, well, mine are similar, but they're a little different. So the key is that the tribal wisdom is out there, and so are the frameworks. So I use ISO 27001, 27017, and 27018. There's a cloud and cloud privacy. I'm SOC 2 level 2, and I'm pursuing FedRAMP, and I have a Japanese government framework. It doesn't get harder. Most of the frameworks are about 90% in common. And by the time you've hit your third or fourth, you can start to add them like you're collecting baseball cards. But I'm being facetious, but then you get audited more. And that's not necessarily a good thing. So you really want the audits to be really testing you and keeping you on your toes. But something like the financial services sector, they get audited, and literally there are auditors in the building every day for big banks.
Got it.
You don't want to be in that situation.
Right. How do you see cybercrime affecting the banking sector?
Well, it's interesting. So back in 2007 to 2014, I actually built a naive Bayesian system, which is a form of machine learning that was tracking credit card fraud across multiple banks' credit card systems, and then we extended it to logins and things. When I was at RSA, we had about 500 million users we were protecting without fobs. And in speaking with the banks themselves, first of all, banks evolved this capacity independently of the security department. They're starting to bring them together. But it was because they couldn't wait for the CISO to understand the business. So the lines of business did it. And they have a number of basis points of loss that's acceptable. Profit margins can handle 1 or 2 basis points of loss, meaning 1/10,000th of 1% of the top line. It's usually 1 or 2. When it starts to exceed 3, it's too much of an impact, and it'll affect the margins in a noticeable way. So I've seen some banks get up to 5 or 6, at which point all hell breaks loose. And the job of the day is to squash it, and they take draconian measures to do so. But they have an acceptable rate, and some countries, the liability for things like fraud against banks lies with the users, not with the banks. I saw this in Malaysia, for instance, and that can be particularly harsh on the customers of the bank. So it varies enormously, and I don't think we've reached it, because most of the fraud that's happening isn't targeting banks now. It's going after enterprise pockets, and the liabilities there and who's responsible and chargebacks very different.
Understood. So what are you saying about the future of attacks? How is it going to look like?
Well, I think it's going to be more of the same with incremental improvements. My biggest concern is that the attackers have a faster rate of incremental improvement than defenders do collectively. And nobody's perfect, and we can win this war, but we're going to have to do things like IOBs to change it. In the ideal world, they have an ROI equation too, right? They have revenue and cost to build the tools. If we force them at a fast rate to be innovating, their margins get hit. And at some point, their backers are not very friendly, and those backers will start to look for new business opportunities, but they're not right now. This is paying too well, right? Follow the money. So If we're slow, then they get a chance to make money. And it doesn't matter if we shut down an avenue or two, they're building them faster. So this is a battle of rates. And I think what we're going to see is more of the same from them. And that means they will grow in scale like a bacteria does when you're not cleaning up the environment. So I think that's critical.
Which is a nice segue to the next question. When does it really pay to have cyber defense in-house, given that there is a shortage of talent?
That's it.
And how do you outsource cyber defense?
Well, I would, exactly like I said with the cloud earlier, I would never abdicate the core functions, meaning they're a service to you. Years ago, when I was a CTO at Arbor Networks, I had a CAB, a customer advisory board, and I asked these collected security officers and CIOs, I said, how many of you have a strategic partner who's a managed security service provider, an MSSP? Every hand went up. And I said, okay, how many of you are doing big projects with them? Every hand went up. I said, how many would give them an A grade? Every hand went down. I said, B, C, a couple hands went up, D, every hand went up. In other words, they were getting P&L relief to work with others, but these people weren't doing the job and they didn't have the means of putting pressure on them to do better. And so my advice is you will get to a certain combination of size and complexity where you need to be doing some stuff in-house. But most of the time, if the CIO is becoming a broker of IT rather than a custodian, the same is true of security. You don't have to have an enormous security team. You can use outsources and service providers, provided you're really the customer, not just a paycheck, and you can vote with your feet, and that you yourself have not abdicated risk management and things like incident response, the key functions of security. You should still own policies, you should still audit, and you should still be able to run incidents yourself.
Understood.
And do risk.
Understood. So Eve has come back again. What are the typical expectations as CISO towards the board? What do you expect from the board on cyber towards your role?
Unfortunately, typically nothing. The sad truth is that most CISOs are afraid to go to the board. It's an infrequent event. And when they get there, they don't know what to show. I think the truly mature companies, that's not true. Certainly not in companies where the CISO reports higher in the organization. But there are certain social skills and business skills and power skills, we used to call them soft skills, I like power skills better, that are absent in most CISOs toolkits. And the reason is most of us came up through the ranks. We were dealing with computers and code, and we were not social creatures. Some of them were parachuted in from other disciplines and are kind of afraid of the technical folks under them a little bit. But a CISO is required to be technical and a business person. And if they can only be one, which is usually the case, to stop being the expert in technical, they know enough and focus on the business skills. In fact, I would suggest that if they don't get an MBA, that they take courses from the MBA curricula, things like how to read a P&L, and what are the principles of business and for whom do you serve, are not necessarily things that most security people know. And so they don't know what to expect from the board. And the board themselves can make that a painful journey because they're used to dealing with CEOs who are dodgy and shifty types. Instead, I think they can send an ambassador to get to know the CISO and make it an easier experience.
Understood. So last question, Sam, I know we've taken a lot of your time.
It's okay. Yeah.
How do you look at cyber insurance? Is that making the problem worse? I kept the best for the last.
I saw this question. in the pre-questions. It may be. So let's start with is it making it worse? I looked at, actually I didn't. I want someone who works for me. I said, hey, all the information from these cities that are getting attacked, that got attacked in 2019, all their public spend numbers are public, right? These are not hidden numbers. Go look at what the ones who had cyber attacks did after the attack. And almost all of them had no increase in IT or security spend and a large increase in cyber. And for me, that's the equivalent here in the United States. Of course, we have life insurance and health insurance we pay for. That's the equivalent of not having health insurance, but having life insurance. So if I tell my wife, honey, we're not going to have health insurance. We don't need it because if I die, you'll get a big check. How's that for a plan? She'll say, that's awful, right? That's kind of what's going on. They're not improving the health of their cyber systems. So that's a bad policy from a defender's perspective. From an attacker's perspective, they hone in pretty quickly on which classes of companies have insurance that will pay and won't. It shows in the yield. So even if it's not measurable, you know it's having an effect on the decisions they're making on the back end. It must. And finally, I mentioned premiums are getting much, much worse. It used to cost $1 for every $1,200 of coverage. That came down to 1 for every 1,000. And now it's down into 1 for every 500 or 600. It's getting more expensive. And the number of exclusions are growing. The pages and pages that say, if you don't do this, we don't pay. And if you did that, we don't pay. And this kind of thing, we don't pay. So I think cyber insurance is a necessary component of any strategy. It is not a strategy though. And there's nothing better than getting healthy.
Got it. Got it. Sam, thank you very much. I've learned a lot. I'm sure all the participants have learned a lot. What we are taking back from this conversation are a lot of things actually, but asymmetry needs to be better managed. How can we make things simpler? How can we look at indicators of behavior as opposed to buying the next new toy? And then there's no standard really. So what matters at the end is the effectiveness of how you execute. So thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you, everyone.
Just hold on
Sure.
For a second, guys. I think Sam has given us a huge amount of information and food for thought that we obviously can think about. Reach out to Sam on LinkedIn as he suggested, and we thank him for his time. So I guess the last question I asked Sam was really to set up the next conversation. And the idea is to invite somebody we've identified the CEO of a cyber insurance company to really talk about this, because cyber insurance is already causing a huge debate in the industry. And is cyber insurance a solution or the solution? And we've heard Sam's opinion, and that's the topic that we'll expose to you next, right? So mark your calendars, 18th of October, 5 p.m. CET. She's an amazing speaker. You will get details in your mailbox shortly. And as you did with Sam, please just make sure that you have your questions ready and submit them, and we'll have a great session then. Thank you very much.